Close your eyes for a moment and picture the landscape where history itself first began. A land where two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, carved winding veins through rich soil, where reeds swayed in the hot winds, and where the first human settlements rose like fragile islands of order against a backdrop of endless wilderness. This is the Middle East, the cradle of civilization. But it is also something more, a stage upon which the earliest mysteries of humanity were written. Archaeologists tell us that long before stone temples or written words, small bands of hunter-gatherers began to settle here. They built simple huts, tamed wild grains, and gradually learned that the land, if cared for, could provide abundance. Some believe this was not merely an accident of geography, but the first spark of destiny, a turning point when mankind's endless wandering gave way to permanence. Imagine the silence of a night broken by the crackle of the first communal fires, or the weight of the first seeds pressed into fertile earth, a soundless revolution that would ripple across millennia. Yet even as farming began, so too did hierarchy, conflict, and control. Some researchers suggest that these earliest villages were already testing the balance between cooperation and domination. Others whisper that myths of Paradise Lost may echo from these first attempts at civilization, when humanity traded freedom for structure and wildness for walls. The Fertile Crescent became a place of beginnings, but also a place of secrets. For in its marshes and plains, we see the outlines of mysteries that still haunt us. Why did humanity settle here first? Was it simply the rivers, or something deeper, some unspoken call to this ground? We will never know for certain. What we do know is that from this moment forward, the Middle East would never again be an empty wilderness. It would become a theater of invention, of ambition, and of unending struggle. And as the sun set over these first settlements, one could almost sense the weight of what was to come. Empires, gods, and bloodlines would rise here, but for now it was only villages. Only whispers of civilization, yet already the ground trembled with the beginnings of history. But if this is where mankind first planted its roots, what came next when those roots stretched into cities, into kingdoms, into powers that dared to defy the heavens themselves? From the quiet villages of the Fertile Crescent, something extraordinary began to take shape. Clay huts turned into walls, paths became streets, and before long the world's first true cities rose from the Mesopotamian plain. Among them was Uruk, a place whispered about by historians as the very first metropolis, where mud brick walls stretched for miles and temple towers reached upward as though trying to pierce the skies. It is here that humanity first learned the art of collective living on a scale previously unimaginable. Imagine the noise, the bleating of goats in crowded courtyards, the clatter of merchants setting out their wares, the chanting of priests as incense curled into the heavens. This was not merely survival, it was civilization. With cities came kings, and with kings came power. The Sumerians believed their rulers were chosen by the gods, men who could bridge the mortal and the divine. Some researchers argue that these myths were less about faith and more about control, a way to bind thousands of people into one order under the shadow of a single throne. Others suggest that the myths were genuine reflections of Orbicus, two ordinary farmers. The sight of ziggurats towering above the flat plain must have seemed like mountains built by divine hands. But perhaps the greatest invention to emerge here was the written word. On clay tablets, pressed with a reed stylus, the first cuneiform signs recorded grain harvests, temple offerings, even epic tales. It was as if humanity, for the first time, realized that memory could be trapped and carried forward. that the past could be preserved beyond the frailty of flesh and voice. Yet this gift was double. Writing allowed kings to record laws, debts, and taxes, tools of authority as much as tools of knowledge. And here we find one of the enduring mysteries of the Middle East. Was civilization a blessing or a chain? Some see in these early cities the birth of progress, the dawn of order. Others see the seeds of inequality, the moment when rulers began to dominate, and the many labored for the few. Still, the Sumerians had set in motion something irreversible. The idea of the city, of gods enthroned in temples, of kings ruling under heaven's mandate, these would echo through every empire that followed. Yet one question lingers. If Uruk and its sister cities were the first to rise, what shadows would they cast over the civilizations yet to come? As the Sumerian cities grew in size and strength, their rivalries sharpened into endless conflicts. One city would rise, only to be humbled by the next. Yet out of this chaos came a figure who changed everything, a man known as Sargon of Akkad. Some say he began as a cupbearer to a king, a servant of little note, yet through cunning and ambition he rose to power. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon forged together the city-states of Mesopotamia into what many call the world's first empire. Imagine the spectacle, armies marching under banners, not for a single city, but for a vision of dominion stretching across the Fertile Crescent. To his people, Sargon was more than a conqueror. He was a chosen figure, blessed by the goddess Ishtar. But to his enemies, he was a shadow spreading across the land, extinguishing independence under the weight of Akkadian might. His empire extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a reach so vast that no ruler before him had attempted it. With it came new systems of control, standing armies, imperial governors, and a language of power that tried to unify diverse peoples under one rule. Some researchers suggest this was the beginning of a dangerous dream. The idea that all lands, all tribes, could be brought beneath a single crown. Yet empires, like men, carry within them the seeds of their downfall. The Akkadian Empire thrived for a century, its culture blending with that of the Sumerians, but whispers of unrest never disappeared. Revolts simmered in the provinces, and over time drought and famine struck the land. The climate shifted, the rivers failed, and the empire that had once seemed unshakable began to fracture. By around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian world collapsed, leaving ruins where once had stood the first vision of empire. And yet Sargon's legacy did not vanish. His idea that a single power could rule many peoples haunted the Middle East for millennia. Every conqueror who followed, from Assyrians to Persians to Romans, walked in the shadow of Akkad's ambition. But history leaves us with an unsettling question. Was Sargon a visionary who showed humanity its potential, or the first tyrant who revealed how fragile freedom becomes when swallowed by empire? When the Akkadian dream collapsed into dust, new powers rose from the remnants. Among them was Babylon, a city whose very name would come to symbolize both grandeur and corruption, glory and downfall. In the early 18th century BCE, a king named Hammurabi seized the throne. Unlike Sargon, who built his empire on conquest alone, Hammurabi crafted his legacy through both war and wisdom. He expanded Babylon's reach until it dominated Mesopotamia. But it was his code, his written laws, that would echo through history. Imagine the scene, a towering stele of black basalt, standing tall in a public square, its surface carved with rows of cuneiform signs. At the top, an image of Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice. Below, hundreds of laws etched forever into stone laws, governing theft, trade, marriage, and punishment. For the first time, ordinary people could look upon a record of justice, one not hidden in the minds of priests or whispered in the chambers of kings, but set down for all to see. Yet justice was not always gentle. Hammurabi's code is remembered for its severity: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Some scholars suggest it was less about fairness and more about deterrence, a way to frighten people into order. Others argue it was revolutionary, giving structure to a world where power often spoke louder than principle. Picture a merchant weighing silver on scales, a farmer disputing land rights, a builder held accountable if his house collapsed. These laws reached into every corner of life, binding Babylon together with more than swords, they bound it with words. Still, beneath the order, shadows lingered. Babylon was a place of wealth, but also of inequality, where slaves toiled, and the poor often bore punishments harsher than the elite. Its ziggurat towered toward the heavens, perhaps inspiring the later tale of the Tower of Babel, a story of ambition punished by divine wrath. Whether myth or memory, it reminds us of the dangerous line between human greatness and hubris. Hammurabi's reign ended, and Babylon would rise and fall many times in centuries to come. Yet his laws remained, fragments of them surviving long after his empire crumbled. They remind us of a question that still unsettles the modern world. Is justice truly about balance, or is it only a reflection of power carved into stone? From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia emerged a force unlike any the world had yet seen. The Assyrians, fierce and relentless, transformed warfare into an art of fear. By the 9th century BCE, their empire spread like wildfire, consuming city after city. Their capital Nineveh was both magnificent and menacing, a place of soaring walls and sprawling palaces, but also of whispered dread. The Assyrians mastered iron, forging weapons deadlier and more durable than bronze. Imagine their armies marching in precise formation, chariots thundering across the plains, archers unleashing volleys of arrows, infantry with iron-tipped spears advancing in waves. Behind them, siege engines' massive wooden towers and battering rams rolled toward city gates, symbols of an unstoppable storm. But it wasn't only their weapons that gave them power, it was their psychology. The Assyrians ruled by terror. Records carved into stone boast of conquered kings flayed alive, of rebels impaled on towering stakes, of entire populations uprooted and scattered. These were not private acts of cruelty, but deliberate performances meant to crush the will of all who dared resist. Some historians see this as brutality beyond comprehension. Others suggest it was a calculated strategy, one that saved lives by discouraging rebellion before it began. Fear, after all, is a weapon more potent than any sword. Yet amid the terror, there was brilliance. The Assyrians built roads that bound their empire, a communication system that allowed orders to travel faster than ever before. They established libraries filled with tablets, most famously that of King Ashurbanipal, whose collection preserved epics, hymns, and medical texts. Without his obsession with knowledge, we might never have rediscovered the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest great story. Still, their cruelty overshadowed their achievements. Neighbors despised them, subject peoples plotted their downfall, and their empire became a giant standing on brittle legs. When Nineveh finally fell in 612 BCE, it was destroyed with such fury that ancient writers compared its end to the wrath of the gods. Its ruins smoldered, its memory cursed, its legacy debated even today. Were the Assyrians brilliant administrators and preservers of culture, or ruthless tyrants consumed by violence? The truth lies in the ruins of Nineveh, where walls whisper both majesty and menace. And so we are left with the haunting image of an empire that ruled with terror, yet also safeguarded humanity's earliest stories, reminding us that even the darkest powers can leave behind light. From the ashes of fallen empires rose a people who would redefine the idea of rule. The Persians, once humble nomads of the Iranian plateau, became the architects of one of history's greatest empires. At the center of this transformation stood Cyrus the Great, a man remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a visionary. By the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus swept across the Middle East like a tide no wall could hold back. He defeated the Medes, humbled the mighty Babylonians, and extended his reach from the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean. Yet his empire was not built solely by the sword. It was sustained by tolerance. Unlike the Assyrians, who ruled by fear, Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs, languages, and gods. When he entered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not burn it, he restored its temples, honored its traditions, and freed captive peoples. The most famous of these acts was the liberation of the Jews who had been exiled by the Babylonians. Some later called him the Lord's Anointed, a ruler chosen by God to bring freedom. This was more than politics. It was philosophy. Cyrus saw empire not as domination, but as unity under diversity. To govern such vast lands, the Persians developed satrapies provinces, overseen by governors, yet tied together by loyalty to the great. King roads cut across mountains and deserts, the most famous being the Royal Road, where mounted couriers carried messages faster than ever before. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness, said one ancient writer, could delay them. Imagine the sense of scale. Palaces glittering at Pasargadae, Persepolis rising from stone like a vision of eternity, columns reaching skyward as if in dialogue with the heavens. Some scholars see Cyrus as a benevolent ruler ahead of his time. Others argue his generosity was simply clever politics, a way to hold together peoples too vast and varied to control by force alone. But one truth is certain: he left behind an empire that endured long after his death, inspiring rulers from Alexander the Great to the founding fathers of America. And so the Persian story begins not only with conquest, but with a question still alive today: is the greatest power that of fear or of freedom? After Cyrus the Great, the empire he forged required a steady hand to not only expand but to hold together. That hand belonged to Darius I, remembered by history as Darius the Great, rising to power in 522 BCE through both ambition and cunning. Darius was not content to merely inherit. He sought to build, to systematize, to bring a vision of order to an empire that spanned 3 continents. Imagine an empire so vast that its borders touched Egypt, India, and the rugged mountains of Anatolia. To govern it, Darius refined the satrapy system, introducing taxes, standardized weights and measures, and even a universal coin, the Daric glemming with gold and stamped with the image of an archer. For the first time, trade could flow with ease across thousands of miles. A farmer in Lydia connected to a merchant in Babylon, a potter in Susa tied to a goldsmith in Bactria. The royal road stretched like an artery through the empire, and with it came a pulse of culture, wealth, and communication. Yet with great order came great ambition. Darius dreamed not only of maintaining Persia, but of pushing its frontiers ever further westward. His eyes fell on Greece, a land of fractious city-states whose independence seemed fragile compared to the grandeur of Persia. When Ionian Greek cities under Persian rule rebelled, supported by Athens, Darius moved swiftly. His campaign reached the plains of Marathon in 490 BCE, where Persian might faced Greek defiance. The Greeks, though outnumbered, broke the Persian lines, sending shockwaves through the ancient world. For the first time, Persia, the empire that seemed invincible, was forced into retreat. Some saw this not as defeat but as a warning, a reminder that even giants can stumble. Yet Darius's achievements cannot be reduced to this single loss. Under his reign, Persepolis rose in splendor. Carved reliefs showing processions of tribute-bearers from every corner of the empire, Ethiopians with ivory, Indians with gold dust, Medes in fine robes. These images were not just art, but ideology. Persia as the center of the world, where all nations bowed in harmony to the great king. Still, the clash with Greece had awakened a new rivalry, one that would echo for centuries the struggle between East and West, empire and independence. And so, with Darius's death, the question lingered. Could his successors maintain both the brilliance of Persia and the fragile balance of its ambitions? When Darius the Great passed, his son Xerxes inherited not only an empire but also a grudge. The sting of defeat at Marathon lingered, and Xerxes vowed to avenge it. In 480 BCE, he launched one of the most ambitious invasions the world had ever seen. Ancient writers describe a force so vast it shook the earth. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from every corner of Persia's dominion, Medes, Egyptians, Indians, Phoenicians, each bearing their own weapons, their own languages, yet united under the banner of the great king. The sea itself seemed to bend beneath the Persian fleet, a massive armada that shadowed the coastline. To cross into Greece, Xerxes ordered a bridge of boats stretched across the Hellespont, engineering, marvel of ropes and planks that turned water into highway. Imagine the spectacle, a river of soldiers and horses marching across the sea, drums pounding, banners rippling in the wind. Yet the Greeks, divided though they were, stood ready. At Thermopylae, the narrow pass between mountain and sea, King Leonidas and his Spartans made their stand. For 3 days they held back the Persian tide, their bronze shields locking, their spears thrusting, their defiance immortalized in legend. Though betrayed and overwhelmed, their sacrifice became a symbol not of victory, but of resistance. Xerxes pressed on, his armies sweeping into Athens, flames consuming the city, the Acropolis smoldering against the sky. For a moment, Persia seemed triumphant, but the sea would tell another story. At Salamis, the Greek navy, outnumbered but cunning, lured the Persian fleet into narrow waters. There, the vast armada became a trap for itself, giant ships colliding, oars breaking, the cries of drowning men echoing across the waves. The Greeks struck with precision, and the great fleet of Persia broke apart. Xerxes watched from his throne on a cliff, helpless as the pride of his navy splintered before his eyes. Defeated, he withdrew, leaving behind a portion of his army that would eventually be beaten at Plataea. The invasion ended not in glory, but in retreat. Xerxes returned to Persepolis, his empire still vast, but his ambitions shattered. Some say the defeat marked the beginning of Persia's slow decline, while others see it as a reminder of how hubris can undo even the mightiest kings. And so the great clash of Persia and Greece left behind not only ruins and ashes, but an eternal question. Is power measured by the size of one's army, or by the will of those who refuse to bow. After the thunder of Xerxes' invasion faded, the Persian Empire still stretched across 3 continents, its cities rich, its roads busy, its palaces gleaming in the desert sun. Yet beneath the surface of its grandeur, cracks began to show. The later kings inherited a throne too vast to control, and while they commanded the loyalty of satraps and the tribute of nations, they struggled to hold together an empire fraying at the edges. Artaxerxes I, Darius II, and their successors faced not just foreign enemies, but internal rebellions flared in Egypt. Satraps grew powerful and defiant, and court intrigues poisoned the heart of Persepolis. The empire that Cyrus built on tolerance began to waver as corruption spread through its veins. Still, Persia remained a land of wonder. Imagine the palace at Persepolis, its columns soaring skyward, each one carved with rows of bulls and lions. Tribute bearers filed through its halls in endless procession, Armenians with horses, Nubians with ivory, Indians with baskets of gold dust. On the walls, stone reliefs told a story of unity, of nations bound together under one king. But the image was stronger than the reality. The Greeks, once scattered and fragile, had grown stronger after their victories. Athens rose to dominance with its navy, while Sparta wielded the harsh discipline of its warriors. Their wars with each other created chaos, yet in that chaos lay a dangerous opportunity. Persian kings learned to exploit Greek rivalries with gold rather than swords, funding one city-state against another, turning the Aegean into a chessboard of Persian influence. For a time, it worked. But the Greeks were restless, their pride untamed, their hunger for freedom unbroken. In the West, a new power began to stir a kingdom once considered marginal, half barbarian to the Greeks themselves. Macedonia. Persia still loomed as the world's greatest empire. Yet its armies were bloated with mercenaries, its leaders more interested in court luxuries than the battlefield. The empire appeared eternal, its palaces solid as stone, its roads stretching endlessly across the horizon. And yet history teaches that even the mightiest walls can crumble from within. The question lingered in the minds of those who looked upon Persepolis' grandeur: was the Persian Empire still a living force, or merely a shadow waiting for the blow that would bring it down? Into the weakening heart of Persia marched a storm from the west. His name was Alexander, a young king of Macedonia, trained by Aristotle, hardened by war, and burning with a vision that fused ambition with destiny. To the Greeks, he was the avenger of Xerxes' invasion, the champion who would finally bring Persia to its knees. To the Persians, he was an upstart, yet one who moved with the force of inevitability. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with a small but disciplined army. At the Battle of Granicus, he swept aside the Persian satraps, his cavalry cutting through their ranks like lightning through dry fields. Next came Issus in 333 BCE, where Darius III himself faced Alexander. Picture the scene: the Persian king commanding a massive army that stretched across the plains, chariots bristling with scythe-like blades, elephants looming as living fortresses. And yet, amidst the chaos, Alexander led a direct charge at Darius. The great king, stunned, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his family and treasures. That image, Darius in retreat, became a symbol of Persia's fading glory. But Alexander was not done. He marched south, taking Phoenician ports one by one, besieging Tyre for 7 brutal months until its walls fell. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator, crowned pharaoh, and declared the son of the god Amen. The old world seemed to bow to him. Finally, in 331 BCE, at Gaugamela, the fate of Persia was sealed. Darius assembled a vast army on the plains, his numbers dwarfing Alexander's, yet once again strategy outshone size. Alexander feigned weakness, drew the Persians into disarray, and then struck the decisive blow. Darius fled once more, his empire crumbling behind him. Alexander entered Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the heart of Persian majesty. In Persepolis, flames consumed the grand palace, whether by drunken accident or deliberate vengeance remains debated. Columns cracked, walls blackened, and the city that had symbolized Persian pride was reduced to ash. With Darius hunted down and killed by his own men, the Achaemenid dynasty ended. Persia, once the greatest empire the world had ever seen, was now part of Alexander's new vision, a fusion of East and West, and yet, the question endures, was Persia truly conquered? Or did its culture seep into Alexander's own dream, shaping the Hellenistic world that followed? For in every ruin, in every burned column of Persepolis, echoes of Persia remained, whispering that empires may fall, but their spirit endures. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, at the age of just 32, his empire shattered like glass dropped upon stone. He left no clear heir, only generals, ambitious, ruthless, and unwilling to kneel before one another. The vast lands he had conquered were divided, and in the Middle East, this division created a new world, the Hellenistic kingdoms. Chief among them was the Seleucid Empire, ruled by Seleucus, one of Alexander's trusted commanders. Imagine Babylon, once again a center of power, now infused with Greek ideas, streets filled with merchants speaking both Greek and Aramaic, its temples standing beside new gymnasiums and theaters. Cities sprang up across the region bearing Alexander's name: Alexandria in Egypt, in Syria, even in the heart of Mesopotamia. These were more than settlements. They were statements of intent. They brought Greek architecture, language, and philosophy into lands that had once bowed to the great kings of Persia. Yet this blending of cultures was not seamless. To the Greeks, the Middle East offered ancient wisdom, mystery, and wealth. To the peoples of the region, the Greeks often seemed arrogant, determined to impose their customs upon lands that already carried thousands of years of history. Still, out of this tension emerged something remarkably effusion. In art, we see it in statues that blend Greek realism with Persian symbols. In religion, Greek gods mingled with Eastern deities, creating hybrid cults that reflected the complexity of identity in this new world. In science, Alexandria in Egypt became a beacon of knowledge, its great library collecting texts from across the known world. Yet the Seleucids struggled to hold their diverse empire together. Rebellions fled constantly. Local dynasties reasserted themselves, none more dramatically than in Judea, where resistance to Hellenistic rule eventually ignited the Maccabean revolt, a story still remembered today in the celebration of Hanukkah. And in the West, another power was rising. Rome, slow and steady, patient and ruthless. The Hellenistic Middle East was caught in a storm of shifting alliances, mercenary armies, and ambitious kings. It was a world vibrant with exchange, but also fragile, vulnerable to the next great force that sought to dominate its lands. The age of the Greeks in the Middle East was brilliant but unstable, like a flame burning bright but destined to flicker. And as that flame began to fade, a question loomed. Would the region return to its old powers, or was it already being drawn into the orbit of a new empire, one that would call itself eternal? The Romans began as a small city-state, yet by the 2nd century BCE, their ambitions had already carried them far beyond Italy. They had conquered Carthage, subdued Greece, and their gaze inevitably turned eastward, to the lands of the Middle East lands, rich with grain, gold, silk, and sacred traditions. What began as cautious diplomacy soon hardened into intervention, and intervention into conquest. The Seleucid Empire, once the proud heir of Alexander, was weakened by internal strife and endless wars. Rome, ever opportunistic, positioned itself as arbiter, then as master. In 190 BCE, at the Battle of Magnesia, Roman legions crushed the Seleucids, forcing them into humiliating treaties. From that moment, Rome's shadow stretched across Asia Minor and beyond. Picture the march of disciplined legions through territories that had once bowed to Persian kings, the clash of iron-shod boots, the glint of rectangular shields, the steady advance of formations that seemed unbreakable. To local rulers, Rome presented itself as protector, yet beneath the promise of stability lay the iron fist of tribute and obedience. Over time, provinces were carved out of ancient kingdoms Syria, Judea, and eventually Egypt, each falling under the orbit of Rome's power. But the East was not an easy prize. The region was steeped in traditions older than Rome itself, and resistance burned hot. In Judea, revolts flared again and again, fueled by resentment against foreign rulers and their interference with sacred laws. In Parthia, a new power emerged from the Iranian plateau. Heirs not to Greece but to Persia, and they proved a formidable foe. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, Roman legions met disaster, their standards captured, their pride shattered in the desert sands. Even Rome, it seemed, could bleed. Yet Rome did not relent. Egypt, once the jewel of the Ptolemies, was finally annexed in 30 BCE, after the dramatic fall of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. With it, Rome gained the breadbasket of the Nile, securing its dominance across the Mediterranean and deep into the Middle East. Still, the region never fully bent to Rome's will. Its deserts and mountains nurtured rebellion. Its cultures resisted assimilation. Its gods and prophets spoke in voices Rome could not silence. And so Rome entered the East not as unquestioned master, but as participant in a struggle older and deeper than itself. The question lingered, could an empire born on the Tiber truly tame the lands of Babylon, Jerusalem, and the Nile, or would the East transform Rome instead? As Rome's banners spread across the Middle East, they soon discovered a truth that every conqueror before them had learned. The region was not easily subdued. In the East, the Parthians emerged as heirs of Persia, masters of cavalry whose horse archers moved with deadly precision. They were unlike the armies Rome had crushed in Greece or Carthage. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, Roman legions, under Crassus wealthy, ambitious, and arrogant, marched into the desert seeking glory. Instead, they were surrounded by Parthian riders whose arrows darkened the sky. Legionnaires fell in ranks, their famous discipline broken by a force that refused to fight on Roman terms. Crassus himself was killed, and his army annihilated, leaving Rome humiliated, its standards captured as trophies. The Middle East, it seemed, would not simply bow. Yet Rome's greatest struggles were not only with Parthians, but with ideas and faiths rising from the soil of the region. In Judea, the Jewish people lived under Roman rule uneasily. They tolerated governors and garrisons. But their faith was rooted in a covenant older than any empire, and their devotion to their God allowed no rival. Rebellions flared first, small, then vast. In 66 CE, the Great Jewish Revolt erupted, and Roman legions laid siege to Jerusalem. Imagine the city surrounded, its walls battered, its defenders starving. In 70 CE, the temple of the heart of Jewish worship was set ablaze, its golden menorah carried off to Rome as spoils. Yet destruction did not extinguish devotion. It hardened it. Later, revolts followed, most famously the Bar Kokhba uprising in 132 CE. When Jews rallied under a messianic leader against overwhelming odds, Rome responded with fury, leveling towns, scattering survivors, and renaming the land to erase its identity. Still, faith endured. And while Rome crushed rebellions, a new current began to stir quietly across the region. Prophets, teachers, and visionaries spoke of kingdoms not of stone but of spirit. In villages and marketplaces, whispers spread of justice, of redemption, of hope that transcended legions and emperors. Some Romans dismissed these voices as superstition. Others sensed a dangerous power rising. The Middle East had long been the crucible of gods and empires, but now it was becoming the birthplace of something Rome could neither predict nor control. The clash of swords defined the present, but in the shadows, ideas were gathering that would soon reshape the entire world. The question grew louder. Could Rome command bodies while losing hearts and souls? In the 1st century CE, in a small province at the edge of Rome's empire, an event occurred that would alter not only the Middle East, but the entire trajectory of history. In Judea, under the watchful eyes of Roman governors and soldiers, a teacher emerged, Jesus of Nazareth. He preached not of empires and legions, but of forgiveness, humility, and a kingdom not built on stone, but within the soul. His words spread among fishermen, tax collectors, and villagers, echoing across hillsides where crowds gathered to hear a voice that promised hope to the poor, dignity to the outcast, and eternal life to all who believed. Rome, with its iron discipline and polytheistic gods, had no place for such teachings. Yet the message of Jesus defied suppression. He was crucified under Roman authority, a punishment reserved for rebels and criminals, a death meant to erase memory. But his followers claimed his resurrection, a miracle that turned defeat into victory. From that moment, Christianity was born not as a political revolution, but as a spiritual one. Imagine the secret gatherings in the heart of Roman cities, dimly lit rooms where small groups whispered prayers, broke bread and shared wine, believing they communed with the divine. These early Christians faced suspicion and persecution. Some were thrown to wild beasts in amphitheaters, others burned as torches to light imperial gardens. Yet persecution only spread the faith. Merchants carried the message along Roman roads. Sailors brought it to distant ports, and communities formed across the empire, from Antioch to Alexandria, from Ephesus to Rome itself. The Middle East remained its heart, Jerusalem, the site of crucifixion. Antioch, a hub of missionary zeal. Alexandria, where scholars debated the nature of God. Slowly, the faith grew from a small sect into a movement too large to ignore. For Rome, this was both a threat and a puzzle. Here was a belief system that united slaves and nobles, women and men, Jews and Gentiles, in a way no imperial cult had achieved. Some emperors tried to crush it, others tolerated it, but none could extinguish it. In the land where empires had risen and fallen for millennia, a carpenter's son had sown a seed that no legion could uproot. And so a question began to rise. Would Rome absorb this faith into its own system, or would Christianity transform Rome itself? By the early 4th century, Christianity had grown from a persecuted faith practiced in shadows into a force that even emperors could no longer ignore. Rome had executed thousands of Christians, yet their numbers multiplied, their resolve unbroken. In marketplaces, in households, in the vast network of Roman cities, the symbol of the cross began to appear not as a mark of shame, but as a quiet defiance against the empire's might. Then came Constantine, a general who marched under the banner of ambition and found himself at the center of a battle that would reshape both Rome and the faith it once sought to destroy. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine claimed to see a vision, a cross of light in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer," whether a divine revelation or a calculated political move. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol upon their shields. Against the odds, he emerged victorious, seizing Rome and declaring himself emperor. With that triumph, Christianity's fate was forever changed. Constantine did not merely tolerate the faith, he embraced it. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan granted religious freedom throughout the empire, ending centuries of bloodshed. Churches were built openly, clergy gained influence, and Christianity moved from the catacombs into the sunlight of imperial favor. Yet this alliance was not without consequence. A faith once rooted in humility, martyrdom, and spiritual devotion began to intertwine with power, wealth, and politics. Bishops argued over doctrine, councils were convened to settle disputes, and the empire itself became the stage upon which theological battles were fought. The Middle East once again stood at the center of history. Jerusalem, where Christianity was born, became a destination for pilgrims. Alexandria became a crucible of debate, where philosophers and theologians wrestled over the nature of Christ. Antioch became a hub of missionary zeal, sending preachers further east. Constantine even established a new capital, Constantinople, on the edge of Asia and Europe, binding the empire's future to the crossroads of the Middle East. For the first time, Rome and Christianity were no longer enemies but allies, bound in a marriage that would shape laws, culture, and kingdoms for centuries. The humble faith of fishermen had become the religion of emperors, and the once mighty pantheon of Rome's gods faded into silence. But with power came compromise, and with imperial favor came corruption. The seed of empire had entered the soil of faith, raising a haunting question. Had Christianity conquered Rome, or had Rome conquered Christianity? As the Western Roman Empire staggered toward its collapse in the 5th century, the Middle East stood at a crossroads, carrying on the legacies of empire even as the old order crumbled. In the streets of Rome, barbarians marched, cities burned, and emperors fell. But in Constantinople, the empire endured, its walls rising strong against invaders, its heart beating with a vision of Rome that refused to die. While the West fractured into feudal kingdoms and darkened under the weight of decline, the East, anchored in the Middle East, became the vessel of continuity, preserving knowledge, power, and faith. Constantinople, gleaming with golden domes and echoing with the chants of priests, became the capital of a Christian empire that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes pulsed with life, caravans carrying spices, silks, and precious gems through deserts and across seas, reminding the world that the Middle East remained the lifeline of commerce and culture. But the fall of the West created a vacuum, and into that space new powers rose. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival, loomed large. Its palaces filled with luxury, its armies disciplined and formidable. Between Byzantium and Persia stretched a battlefield that would decide the fate of the region. A rivalry of titans fought across deserts, rivers, and mountain passes. And yet, as these two great empires bled each other in endless wars, the Middle East was quietly preparing for a new chapter, one neither Rome nor Persia could foresee. Beneath the weight of imperial struggles, tribes in the deserts of Arabia lived in relative obscurity, bound by kinship, poetry, and trade, their lives shaped by the harsh rhythm of sand and sun. Few in Constantinople or Ctesiphon paid attention to these wandering tribes, dismissing them as inconsequential. Yet history was shifting. The fall of Rome in the West was not merely an end but a beginning, and the Middle East became the torchbearer of civilization. Libraries in Alexandria and Antioch safeguarded ancient wisdom. Scholars copied texts that would otherwise vanish, and artisans created mosaics, manuscripts, and monuments that carried the memory of empires into the future. The old gods were gone, Rome's emperors were dust, and Persia's power, though mighty, was vulnerable. Out of the ruins of the West and the struggles of the East, a silence gathered on the horizon. A silence soon to be broken by a voice from the Arabian desert, a voice that would forever alter the destiny of the Middle East and the world. In the early 7th century, as the Byzantine and Sassanid empires clashed and exhausted themselves, an unseen tide was rising in the deserts of Arabia. Among the rocky hills and vast sands of Mecca, a city known for its caravans and its sacred shrines, the Cobbawan man emerged who would change the course of history. Muhammad, born into the tribe of Quraysh, lived an ordinary life as a merchant before retreating into the solitude of the desert, where silence met the endless stars. It was here, according to tradition, that he received revelations from God, words carried by the angel Gabriel that would become the Quran. These words, spoken in the cadence of poetry and infused with urgency, called for a new vision: one God, one faith, one community united beyond tribal loyalties. At first, his message was met with resistance. Meccan elites, tied to wealth and pilgrimage trade, saw his teaching as a threat. Followers were mocked, beaten, even killed, and Muhammad himself faced exile. Yet persecution only strengthened resolve. In 622 CE, he and his followers fled to Medina, an event known as the Hijra, marking the true beginning of an Islamic community. From Medina, Islam spread with astonishing speed, uniting tribes long divided by blood feuds. The Quran provided not only spiritual guidance but also laws, ethics, and a vision of justice that transcended old boundaries. The voice of the desert began to ripple outward. Mecca eventually fell to Muhammad's leadership, the Kaaba was cleansed of idols, and the Arabian Peninsula, once fragmented and overlooked, now pulsed with unity. Within a generation, Islam was no longer confined to Arabia. Its call echoed across borders, reaching into Byzantine Syria and Persian Iraq, carried by armies but also by faith, trade, and conviction. For the Middle East, this was not merely a new religion, it was a revolution that reshaped identity, politics, and destiny. The old struggle between Byzantium and Persia was eclipsed by a movement neither had anticipated, a force rising from the deserts they had ignored. The unification of Arabia was only the beginning, a spark that lit the fuse of transformation. The caravans no longer just carried goods. They carried belief. The minarets soon to rise across cities would proclaim a new chapter of history. And the question lingered: what happens when a people, once dismissed as insignificant, suddenly carry a vision that demands the world listen? After the death of Muhammad in 632 CE, the question of leadership loomed over the fledgling Muslim community. Yet from this uncertainty emerged the Rashidun Caliphate, guided by the first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, known as the rightly guided. What began as a fragile unity in Arabia quickly transformed into one of the fastest and most astonishing expansions in human history. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, secured the Arabian Peninsula by quelling tribal revolts, ensuring that Islam did not fracture in its infancy. His successor Umar pushed outward with determination and vision, launching campaigns that shattered centuries-old powers. Within a decade, Muslim forces had marched into Byzantine Syria, seized Damascus, and turned toward Egypt, where the Nile became part of the Islamic world. In the east, the mighty Sassanid Empire, Rome's ancient rival, crumbled with startling speed. The Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 and the fall of Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, marked the end of a dynasty that had stood for over 4 centuries. Persia's palaces, filled with gold and luxury, were overrun, and its territories were absorbed into the new Islamic order. By the mid-7th century, the caliphate stretched from the mountains of Iran to the deserts of Libya, an empire larger than Rome at its height, achieved in less than a generation. This expansion was not only military but cultural. Arabic became a language of power, while the Quran unified diverse peoples under a shared spiritual framework. Cities like Kufa, Basra, and Fustat emerged as new centers of governance, buzzing with markets, mosques, and scholars. Yet the rapid growth brought challenges. Questions of leadership, justice, and succession ignited tensions that would soon divide the community, sowing seeds of conflict between Sunni and Shia that echo through history to this day. The Rashidun caliphs ruled with simplicity. Abu Bakr lived modestly. Umar walked the streets at night to oversee the welfare of his people, but simplicity could not contain the weight of empire. The Middle East was now the beating heart of a civilization in motion, its armies undefeated, its faith spreading, its horizons limitless. And as caravans carried not just goods but new ideas across the deserts, a new question haunted the corridors of power. Could the unity forged in faith endure the temptations of wealth, conquest, and ambition, or would the empire fracture under the very speed of its success? With the assassination of Caliph Ali in 661 CE, the age of the Rashidun came to a dramatic close, and from its ashes rose the Umayyad Caliphate, a dynasty that transformed Islam from a community of believers into a vast imperial force. The Umayyads, ruling from their capital in Damascus, carried the crescent banner far beyond Arabia, expanding into North Africa, across the mountains into Spain, and eastward into Central Asia. For the first time in history, a single political entity stretched continuously from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indus River, an empire of dazzling scope and breathtaking speed. Damascus, once a provincial city under the Byzantines, blossomed into the nerve center of the caliphate, its streets filled with traders, scholars, and soldiers. Its mosques stood as symbols of faith and power. The great mosque of Damascus, rising with its minarets piercing the sky, became both a place of worship and a statement of dominance. Arabic was declared the official language of administration, binding together peoples as diverse as Berbers, Persians, Syrians, and Egyptians under a common tongue. Yet the Umayyad project was not without tension. Many early Muslims resented the dynasty's embrace of worldly power, accusing its rulers of straying from the simplicity of Muhammad and the Rashidun. The lavish palaces of Damascus, the jeweled courts, and the hierarchy of elites created unease among those who remembered the austere days of the Prophet. Still, the Umayyads imposed order, building roads, minting coins, and organizing the empire into provinces that pulsed with trade and culture. Caravans moved along the Silk Road, ships sailed the Mediterranean, and markets bustled with goods from China, India, and Africa, making the Middle East the economic hub of the known world. But beneath the wealth and triumph, fractures began to spread. Non-Arab Muslims, known as Mawali, often faced discrimination, taxed differently and treated as second class within the empire they helped build. The memory of Ali's death lingered, fueling loyalty among Shia communities who saw the Umayyads as usurpers. Revolts broke out, dissent simmered, and whispers of a new dynasty grew louder. For all its glory, the Umayyad reign lasted less than a century, undone by the very vastness of its ambition and the discontent within its heart. Yet, in that brief span, it carved Islam into the map of 3 continents, laying the groundwork for the civilization that would follow. And as their rule began to falter, a new family prepared to rise from the shadows, promising both renewal and vengeance, the Abbasids, in 750 CE. The Umayyads fell to a tide of resentment and rebellion, and in their place rose the Abbasid Caliphate, a dynasty that promised justice and a return to the spirit of the Prophet. From their new capital of Baghdad, founded along the banks of the Tigris River, the Abbasids built not only a political center but a beacon of culture and knowledge that would shine across the world. Baghdad was no ordinary city. It was designed as a circle, a symbol of perfection, with walls stretching high and gates opening to every direction of the empire. Within those walls, palaces glittered, markets hummed with goods from every corner of the earth, and mosques echoed with the call to prayer. Yet it was not only power that defined Baghdad, but brilliance. The Abbasids ushered in what came to be known as the Islamic Golden Age, an era when the Middle East became the heart of global learning. Scholars gathered in the House of Wisdom, a grand library and research center where texts from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond were translated into Arabic. The works of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Euclid were preserved, studied, and expanded upon, while new discoveries in algebra, astronomy, and medicine pushed human knowledge forward. Physicians like Al-Razi wrote detailed treatises, astronomers mapped the heavens with precision, and mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi introduced concepts that still shape science today. Paper, brought from China, allowed knowledge to spread rapidly, turning Baghdad into a city of booksellers, poets, and philosophers. Trade flourished. The Tigris carried ships loaded with spices, silk, and precious metals, connecting Baghdad to the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Silk Road. The wealth of empire fueled patronage of the arts, leading to exquisite calligraphy, intricate mosaics, and poetry that captured the imagination of generations. Yet, as with all golden ages, shadows lingered. The Abbasids, though more inclusive than the Umayyads, faced the same challenges of governing vast lands. Regional governors grew powerful, revolts erupted, and sectarian divisions deepened. Still, for centuries Baghdad remained the shining jewel of the Middle East, a city where the pursuit of knowledge was revered as an act of faith and where the blending of cultures created something greater than the sum of its parts. But history is never still. and the same rivers that carried wealth could also carry invaders. Beyond the horizon, threats were gathering: Turks, Crusaders, Mongols. All would one day test the resilience of this golden empire. As centuries passed, the brilliance of the Abbasid Caliphate began to waver under the weight of its own vastness. Baghdad still shone as a beacon of knowledge and trade. But beneath its glittering surface, cracks appeared. Provincial governors grew powerful and independent. Armies became loyal to generals rather than caliphs, and the once unifying vision of the empire splintered into rivalries. In North Africa, new dynasties like the Fatimids established their own caliphates, claiming religious legitimacy and carving away territory. In Persia, local rulers such as the Bids and later the Seljuk Turks seized real authority, leaving the Abbasid Caliph a spiritual figurehead cloaked in ceremonial robes but stripped of practical power. The Middle East became a patchwork of competing states, each vying for influence, wealth, and divine favor. Yet even in decline, the Abbasid realm remained a crossroads of the world, its cities filled with merchants from China, India, Africa, and Europe. It was this richness that caught the attention of outsiders, and in the late 11th century, a new storm gathered on the western horizon: the Crusades. Pope Urban II, seizing upon both religious fervor and political opportunity, called upon the knights of Christendom to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. His words ignited Europe, and waves of warriors, peasants, and zealots marched eastward. When the First Crusade reached Jerusalem in 1099, its outcome was devastating. After a brutal siege, the city fell, and Crusaders slaughtered its inhabitants, Muslim and Jewish alike, leaving its streets soaked in blood. For the first time in centuries, the heart of the Middle East was under foreign Christian rule, and new Crusader states were established along the eastern Mediterranean. The shock of this conquest reverberated across the Islamic world. Muslim chroniclers wrote of it as both a humiliation and a call to unity, sparking leaders to rise in defense of lands considered sacred. Though divided, the Middle East was not powerless, and in time, figures like Nur al-Din and the legendary Saladin would emerge, weaving together faith, strategy, and determination to push back. Yet in these early days of the Crusades, the Islamic world found itself on the defensive, its golden age now overshadowed by an age of conflict. Still, the struggle was not merely one of swords and castles, it was a clash of worlds, of civilizations colliding at the crossroads, where faith, empire, and destiny met. And the question lingered: could the fractured heirs of the Abbasids withstand the fury of Christendom, or would the Holy Land remain forever lost? From the chaos of division and the shock of the Crusader conquest, there emerged a leader whose name would echo through the centuries: Salah al-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, within the heart of Mesopotamia, he rose not from noble arrogance, but from a family of Kurdish military commanders, serving first under the powerful Nur al-Din of Syria. Saladin's rise was steady, marked by discipline, intelligence, and a reputation for fairness that won him loyalty in an age of betrayal. By the time he ascended to leadership, the Middle East was weary of Crusader strongholds dotting the Levant and the humiliation of Jerusalem's loss. Saladin envisioned more than mere survival. He sought unity in a fractured Islamic world. One by one, he brought territories under his control: Egypt, Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, crafting a coalition not through brute force alone, but through diplomacy and the promise of restoring dignity. His armies, disciplined and guided by faith, clashed with crusaders across the Levant, But it was at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 that his legend was truly forged. There, near the scorching plains of Galilee, Saladin encircled and crushed the Crusader forces, capturing their king and breaking their strength. With the enemy crippled, he marched toward Jerusalem, the city at the heart of the world's longing. Unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, Saladin's entry into Jerusalem was marked by restraint. He allowed Christian residents to ransom their freedom, safeguarded holy sites, and restored the Dome of the Rock as a symbol of Islam's return. Even his enemies wrote of his chivalry, describing him as a warrior who balanced steel with mercy. Yet his victory was not the end. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe, leading to the Third Crusade, where kings like Richard the Lionheart sailed across the sea to challenge him. Their duels, fought in sieges and battles along the Levantine coast, became the stuff of legend, stories of rivalry and respect between two leaders locked in a contest larger than themselves. Though Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the Crusader presence lingered. Castles like Acre and Antioch still bristling with defiance. Saladin's triumph was thus both monumental and incomplete, a reminder that the struggle for the Holy Land was far from over. But in his vision of unity and his reputation for honor, he gave the Middle East not just a hero, but a symbol of what could be achieved when faith and leadership rose above division. The question that followed was whether his successors could hold together the fragile unity he had built, or whether the region would once again fall prey to the weight of its own rivalries. After Saladin's death in 1193, the unity he had so carefully forged began to unravel. His heirs quarreled over succession, carving his empire into fragments, and the fragile cohesion that had beaten back the Crusaders dissolved into rivalry. Into this weakened landscape came the later Crusades, less successful than the first, but still disruptive to the Middle East. The Fourth Crusade, originally aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem, was diverted to Constantinople in 1204, where Crusaders sacked the Byzantine capital, shattering the empire that had stood for centuries and weakening one of the great bulwarks of the region. Meanwhile, in the Levant, Crusader strongholds persisted, their massive stone castles looming defiantly over the landscape. Fortresses like crack-day chevaliers became symbols of foreign occupation, impregnable walls that Muslim armies struggled to breach. Yet while Crusaders continued their efforts, they no longer commanded the same unity or fervor of the earlier expeditions. Internal conflicts within Europe, dwindling resources, and the stubborn resilience of Muslim states limited their reach. The Middle East, though still fractured, gradually regained ground, reclaiming cities and tightening control. But just as the Crusader tide began to ebb, a new and far more terrifying force appeared on the horizon: the Mongols. Sweeping out of the steppes of Central Asia, the Mongols were unlike any enemy the Middle East had ever faced. Ruthless, fast, and seemingly unstoppable, they burned cities to ash and left fields littered with corpses. Entire populations were slaughtered to instill fear, and their reputation preceded them like a shadow of doom. By the mid-13th century, they surged westward, overrunning Persia and descending upon Mesopotamia. The once glorious Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasids and heart of the Islamic Golden Age, became their target. In 1258, the Mongols besieged the city, breaching its walls and unleashing a massacre so severe that chroniclers wrote of rivers running black with ink from destroyed, libraries and red with blood from the slain. The Caliph was executed, and Baghdad's greatness was extinguished in a single brutal stroke. The world of the Abbasids, the shining beacon of learning and trade, lay in ruins, and the Middle East trembled under the hoofbeats of an enemy that seemed destined to consume everything in its path. Yet even amid this devastation, the seeds of resistance stirred, for the Mongols would eventually meet a force in the region that would halt their advance and remind the world that the Middle East, though battered, was never defeated. The looming question was who would rise to face them, and whether the torch of civilization could survive such a storm. As the Mongol storm swept across the Middle East, leaving smoldering ruins where once stood cities of splendor, it seemed no force could resist their tide. Yet in Egypt, a new power was rising, one born not of dynasties or noble blood, but of slaves. The Mamluks, originally Turkic and Circassian soldiers purchased as slaves and trained to serve the armies of Islamic rulers, had forged themselves into a disciplined military elite, hardened by years of service and fiercely loyal to their own brotherhood. They seized power in Cairo, toppling their masters and establishing a regime of their own. When the Mongols, fresh from the sack of Baghdad, turned their gaze toward Syria and Palestine, the Mamluks stood as the last line of defense. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the impossible happened. The Mongol advance was stopped. On the plains of Galilee, under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz and the brilliant General Baybars, Mamluk cavalry clashed with the seemingly invincible Mongol horde, with tactics that combined speed, discipline, and cunning. They broke the Mongol lines and sent shockwaves across the known world. For the first time, the Mongols had been decisively defeated, and the myth of their invincibility shattered. The victory was more than military. It was symbolic, restoring hope to a region devastated by fire and sword. From Cairo, the Mamluks established a dynasty that would rule for centuries, guarding the Islamic heartlands against both Mongols and Crusaders. They rebuilt cities, restored trade, and filled their capital with grand mosques and madrasas, making Cairo the new jewel of the Islamic world after Baghdad's fall. Baybars, who would later take the throne, proved a tireless defender, crushing Crusader strongholds one by one, reducing their presence to coastal enclaves that withered under pressure. Under the Mamluks, Egypt and Syria thrived as centers of learning, art, and commerce, while their armies maintained a vigilance unmatched in the region. Yet theirs was a rule of paradox built by slaves, sustained by might, and often marred by internal strife. Power passed not through bloodlines, but through coups and assassinations, with ambitious generals rising and falling in a cycle of intrigue. Still, the Mamluks stood as proof that resilience could overcome catastrophe. Against the Mongols, against the Crusaders, they had held the line, and for a time the Middle East breathed again. But history never rests, and even as the Mamluks celebrated their victories, new powers stirred beyond the horizon powers that would eventually eclipse even their defiance in the rugged frontier lands of Anatolia, where remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate had fractured into rival beyliks. A small principality under the leadership of Osman I began its quiet ascent. What started as a modest domain of warriors on horseback grew through persistence, opportunism, and faith into the nucleus of an empire that would one day dominate 3 continents. The Ottomans, as they came to be known, thrived on the chaos left behind by Mongol invasions and Byzantine decline. Their warriors, known as Ghazis, fought not only for land but also under the banner of Islam, attracting followers eager for conquest and spoils. With each generation, their strength expanded, their armies disciplined, and their strategies sharpened. Osman's successors carried his vision forward, pushing deep into Byzantine territories, testing the defenses of a crumbling empire whose glory had long since waned. By the time of Sultan Mehmed II, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror. The Ottomans were no longer a frontier power, but a formidable state with ambitions far beyond Anatolia. In 1453, Mehmed laid siege to Constantinople, the city once hailed as the Queen of Cities, the last bastion of the Roman world. Cannons thundered against the ancient walls, some of them so massive they shook the earth with every shot, signaling the dawn of a new kind of warfare. After weeks of relentless assault, the mighty walls that had withstood centuries finally crumbled, and the Ottomans poured into the city. Constantinople fell, and with it the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was extinguished. Mehmed rode through the streets, transforming the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and declared the city his capital, renaming it Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople sent ripples through Europe and the Islamic world alike, for it was not only a conquest of land, but of history itself. With the capture of the city, the Ottomans inherited both the legacy of Rome and the mantle of Islamic leadership, positioning themselves as heirs to two worlds. From this moment forward, the Ottoman Empire surged outward into the Balkans, across the Mediterranean, and deep into the Middle East, blending cultures, peoples, and traditions under its vast dominion. Yet with every conquest came new challenges, for the empire would find itself constantly balancing expansion with governance, unity with diversity, ambition with stability. The rise of the Ottomans marked the beginning of a new chapter in Middle Eastern history, one in which Istanbul would shine as the center of power, faith, and intrigue for centuries to come. Under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached the zenith of its power, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the North African coast to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. Ascending the throne in 1520, Suleiman was more than a conqueror. He was a statesman, a lawgiver, and a patron of the arts, whose vision expanded the empire, not only through military campaigns, but also through governance and culture. His armies marched with discipline and unmatched ferocity, defeating rivals such as the Hungarians at Mahax, and challenging the very heart of Christian Europe. At sea, his admiral Barbarossa ruled the Mediterranean, turning it into an Ottoman-dominated lake where European fleets trembled at the sight of his sails. Yet Suleiman's greatness did not rest on conquest alone. He earned the title Kanuni, the lawgiver, by reforming the empire's legal system, harmonizing Islamic law with the needs of a vast and diverse population. His policies brought order to an empire of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, each bound by loyalty to the Sultan, yet allowed a measure of religious and cultural autonomy under the millet system. The empire under Suleiman was not only powerful but dazzlingly rich, with Istanbul serving as a hub where East met West, where caravans from Persia brought silk, ships from India carried spices, and merchants from Europe sought treasures they could not find at home. Architecture flourished under the genius of Maimur Sinan, who raised mosques and palaces that still dominate Istanbul's skyline, while poets and scholars enjoyed patronage that allowed their works to thrive in an age of brilliance. Suleiman himself was a man of contradictions, feared as a conqueror, yet admired as a wise ruler, ruthless in battle, yet tender in his love for Harem Sultan, his controversial consort who influenced the politics of the court in ways both admired and despised. His reign embodied the height of Ottoman glory, yet it also sowed the seeds of intrigue. For the succession struggles and internal rivalries that brewed during his time would cast long shadows over his empire's future. When Suleiman died in 1566 on campaign in Hungary, he left behind an empire vast and seemingly invincible, but one that would, in time, face the limits of expansion, the burdens of administration, and the relentless tides of history that no ruler, however magnificent, could control. After the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire continued to project strength across 3 continents, but beneath the glittering surface of its vast dominion, cracks slowly began to appear. The following centuries were marked not by dramatic collapse, but by a gradual unraveling, a slow bleed of vitality that spread across politics, the economy, and the military. The sultans who followed Suleiman often lacked his commanding vision, with many consumed by palace intrigues and distracted by the growing influence of the harem and court factions. This period, sometimes described by historians as the Sultanate of Women, saw consorts, mothers, and palace officials wielding power behind the veil of the throne, shaping decisions in ways that created both stability and corruption. Meanwhile, the Janissaries, once the disciplined backbone of the Ottoman army, grew complacent, resisting modernization, and often turning their loyalty into rebellion when reforms threatened their privileges. Economically, the empire was being bypassed by the great maritime powers of Europe, who had opened sea routes around Africa to India and the Far East, diminishing the Ottoman monopoly on overland trade routes that once enriched Istanbul's coffers. Silver from the New World flooded Europe and destabilized Ottoman currency, driving inflation that hurt both peasant and merchant alike. In provinces far from the capital, governors acted with increasing autonomy, sometimes enriching themselves at the expense of imperial control, while rebellions simmered among discontented populations. Wars with Austria, Poland, Persia, and later Russia drained resources and manpower, with victories becoming rarer and defeats more common, signaling that the empire's military supremacy was no longer unchallenged. Yet even in this decline, the empire remained vast, complex, and resilient, adapting to challenges with reforms and new policies that slowed the pace of decay. Some historians argue that the decline is a myth, that the Ottomans remained a formidable power well into the 17th century, but the signs of fatigue were undeniable: bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption in the tax system, a population struggling under heavy burdens, and a ruling class increasingly insulated from the realities of its people. The empire still stood as a colossus, but like an ancient oak, its roots were rotting from within even as its branches continued to stretch wide. The question whispered in the shadows of Istanbul's palaces was no longer how far the Ottomans could expand, but how long they could resist the pressures mounting from both within and without. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire still commanded vast lands. Yet the dream of further conquest into the heart of Europe reached its dramatic climax at the walls of Vienna in 1683. For centuries, the Ottomans had advanced steadily into European territory, their armies feared as unstoppable, their banners casting long shadows over Christian kingdoms. Vienna, the gateway to Central Europe, had already faced Ottoman assault in 1529 under Suleiman, but that attempt had faltered. Now, more than 150 years later, the empire sought once again to bring this city into its grasp. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led the campaign with a force numbering in the tens of thousands, an army of janissaries, cavalry, and artillery that struck terror as it advanced. The siege began in July, with trenches dug, cannons roaring, and walls crumbling under relentless fire. For weeks, the fate of Europe seemed to hang in the balance, the defenders weakened and desperate. Yet in September, the tide turned with the arrival of a coalition led by King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, whose cavalry charge became legendary as one of the largest in history. The Ottomans, overwhelmed and broken, retreated in defeat, their dream of capturing Vienna forever dashed. This battle marked more than a single lost campaign. It was a symbolic turning point. No longer would the Ottomans be seen as an unstoppable wave pressing into Europe. Instead, the empire would increasingly find itself on the defensive. The loss reverberated across the empire, shaking confidence and emboldening rivals. From this moment forward, wars with Austria, Russia, and other European powers would chip away at Ottoman strength, exposing weaknesses in leadership, logistics, and military innovation. Some historians describe Vienna as the moment when the empire's expansion ended and its long decline began, though others argue that its vitality lingered for another century. Still, the psychological blow was undeniable. The mystique of invincibility was shattered. In the coffeehouses of Istanbul and the marketplaces of Cairo, whispers grew of how such a mighty army could be turned back. The siege of Vienna was not merely a military defeat. It was the first true crack in the armor of an empire that had once seemed destined to rule unchallenged. The question that lingered was not only about lost territory, but about the shifting balance of power. Was this the dawn of European ascendancy and the dusk of Ottoman supremacy? In the century that followed the failed siege of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire found itself repeatedly locked in brutal struggles with two rising powers, Austria to the west and Russia to the north. These wars, fought across the plains of Hungary, the Balkans, and the steppes of Ukraine, became a relentless drain on Ottoman strength, sapping resources and exposing the empire's fading military edge. Russia, under rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, sought access to the Black Sea and a path to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, ambitions that placed it in direct conflict with Ottoman control of Crimea and surrounding territories. Campaign after campaign was waged, with Russian forces modernizing, disciplined, and eager to push southward, while the Ottoman armies struggled with outdated tactics and internal divisions. Austria, allied at times with Poland and Venice, also pressed its advantage, seizing lands in Hungary and the Balkans as Ottoman forces struggled to hold their ground. Treaties such as Karlowitz in 1699 and KK Kanaka in 1774 reflected the empire's losses, forcing it to cede valuable lands and granting Russia influence over Orthodox Christians within Ottoman borders, an ominous precedent that gave Moscow both a foothold and an excuse to intervene in Ottoman affairs. These defeats carried not only territorial costs, but psychological ones, as the empire that had once terrified Europe was now seen as vulnerable, even weak, in the face of coordinated European armies. The Janissaries, once elite warriors, resisted reforms that could have restored Ottoman strength, clinging to privileges while the world around them changed. Economically, the empire staggered under the weight of these conflicts, with tax burdens rising, trade disrupted, and peasant revolts breaking out in provinces where discontent festered. Yet the empire endured, adapting where it could, negotiating truces, and leveraging its size to remain a significant power even as its dominance waned. Too many within the empire, the wars with Austria and Russia were not only about land, but about survival itself. A struggle to maintain relevance in a world where Europe's balance of power was shifting. To outsiders, these wars signaled the beginning of what would later be called the Eastern Question, a phrase whispered in European courts as diplomats wondered not if, but when, the empire would collapse and how its vast territories might be divided. The lingering question was whether the Ottomans could reform fast enough to withstand the storm, or if their fate was already sealed by the tide of history turning against them. As the 19th century unfolded, the Ottoman Empire, once the towering force of 3 continents, found itself increasingly battered by the twin storms of nationalist uprisings and European interference. Across the Balkans, subject peoples who had long endured Ottoman rule began to demand independence. Inspired by ideas of nationalism sweeping across Europe, the Greeks rose first, igniting the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. A struggle marked by brutal massacres on both sides, but ending with the recognition of Greece as a sovereign state, aided by the intervention of Britain, France, and Russia. This set a dangerous precedent. The empire's internal crises were now international concerns, with foreign powers eager to carve influence from Ottoman weakness. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria soon followed. Pushing for autonomy or outright independence, their revolts often crushed with violence, yet ultimately succeeding as European states intervened to support them. At the same time, Egypt under Muhammad Ali grew into a semi-independent power, modernizing its army and administration, and challenging Ottoman authority directly until European pressure forced compromise. The empire, desperate to survive, launched its own reform programs known as the Tanzimat, introducing new legal codes, reorganizing the military, and attempting to centralize administration to prevent further disintegration. Yet reforms clashed with entrenched traditions and conservative resistance, leaving them only partially effective. Economically, the empire sank deeper into debt, borrowing heavily from European banks to finance its modernization, only to find itself entangled in financial dependency that reduced its sovereignty. The Eastern question became the obsession of European diplomacy, with Britain, France, Austria, and Russia maneuvering constantly to gain advantage from Ottoman decline while preventing outright collapse that could destabilize the balance of power. The Crimean War of the 1850s demonstrated both Ottoman weakness and Europe's competing interests, as Britain and France propped up the empire against Russian expansion, not out of loyalty but out of fear of Russian dominance. In the streets of Istanbul, ordinary people sensed the fragility of their empire, while in the provinces, nationalist fervor grew with every rumor of independence movements abroad. The Ottoman Empire remained vast, but it was increasingly described as the sick man of Europe, a phrase that captured its precarious states still alive, still formidable in some respects, yet visibly ailing, its strength ebbing away with each passing decade. The haunting question for both the Ottomans and Europe was not whether the empire would crumble, but when and under whose hands its fall would finally come. When the guns of August roared in 1914, the Ottoman Empire, already weakened by centuries of decline and decades of territorial losses, was drawn into the global conflict that would ultimately seal its fate. Aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans hoped to regain lost prestige and perhaps even recover lands ceded to rivals. But instead, the war exposed the empire's fragility in brutal detail. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, though remembered as a heroic Ottoman defense under the command of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, was one of the few bright spots in a war that otherwise drained the empire of men, money, and morale. On multiple fronts, the Ottomans struggled: in Mesopotamia against the British, in the Caucasus against the Russians, and in Arabia, where the famed Arab Revolt, fueled by promises of independence and aided by British officers like T.E. Lawrence, shattered Ottoman control of its desert provinces. The empire's internal divisions grew sharper, with ethnic tensions boiling over in catastrophic ways. the most infamous being the Armenian deportations and massacres of 1915. A dark and tragic episode that remains bitterly contested but marked the empire's desperate attempt to maintain control amid fears of betrayal. As the war dragged on, famine gripped Lebanon and Syria. Discontent grew in Anatolia, and the Ottoman economy collapsed under the strain of blockade and mismanagement. By 1918, the empire was a hollow shell of its former self, its armies retreating, its provinces slipping from its grasp, and its people exhausted by suffering. The armistice of Mudros brought the fighting to an end for the Ottomans. But what followed was humiliation. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, carved up Ottoman lands, and drew borders that ignored the fabric of centuries. The Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France secretly divided much of the Middle East into spheres of influence, betraying promises made to Arab leaders during the war and planting seeds of mistrust that linger to this day. The once mighty empire that had ruled over Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Greeks, Armenians, and countless others for centuries was gone. Its authority stripped away piece by piece until only Anatolia remained. For the people of the region, the collapse was both an ending and a beginning. A moment when the old world vanished in flames and the uncertain shape of the modern Middle East began to emerge from its ashes. Yet the lingering question was whether the fragments left behind could ever be molded into stable states, or if the empire's collapse had unleashed forces that would haunt the region for generations. In the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, a new struggle emerged that would determine the fate of Anatolia and reshape the Middle East. The Allied victors of the First World War had little intention of allowing the Ottoman heartland to remain intact. Under the Treaty of Sevres in Ijoarling, vast portions of Anatolia were to be partitioned. With Greece receiving Smyrna, Armenia promised independence, and the southern coasts carved into spheres of influence for France and Italy. Istanbul, the jewel of the Bosphorus, was under Allied occupation, its streets patrolled by foreign soldiers, its people humiliated by the visible end of centuries of sovereignty. Yet from the ruins rose a resistance movement, led by Mustafa Kemal, the commander who had already proven his skill at Gallipoli. Rejecting the terms of partition, Kemal rallied nationalist forces, organizing what became the Turkish War of Independence. Through fierce battles against Greek armies in the west, Armenian forces in the east, and occupying powers across Anatolia, the nationalists steadily regained control of their homeland, uniting disparate groups under the vision of a sovereign Turkish republic. By 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced Sevres, recognizing the new borders of Turkey and officially ending foreign occupation. The Ottoman Sultanate was abolished, the Caliphate soon dismantled, and in its place emerged the Republic of Turkey, with Kemal, now Ataturk, steering it toward secularism, nationalism, and modernization, while Anatolia found a new path. The Arab provinces once under Ottoman rule were divided among European powers under the Mandate system, a colonial arrangement disguised as guardianship. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, while France assumed authority over Syria and Lebanon, each imposing borders and administrations that ignored the region's complex ethnic and sectarian fabric. Promises of Arab independence made during the war were abandoned, fueling resentment and planting the seeds of future unrest. Meanwhile, the discovery of oil in Iraq and the Persian Gulf began to transform the region into a strategic prize, drawing deeper foreign interest and ensuring that the Middle East would remain a theater of global competition. Thus, the fall of the Ottoman Empire did not bring clarity or peace, but rather a new era defined by nationalism, colonialism, and the struggle for self-determination. The question that lingered was whether these newly carved states could forge stable identities out of imposed borders, or whether the ghosts of empire and foreign meddling would continue to haunt their future. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen the Middle East emerge as one of the most contested, turbulent, and symbolically charged regions in the world, a place where the echoes of its ancient past and imperial legacies continue to shape the present. After the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the imposition of European mandates, nationalist movements swept across the region, giving birth to modern states such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and eventually Israel, each carrying the weight of borders drawn in foreign offices and compromises made in distant capitals. Independence brought hope, yet it also carried fractures as ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions resurfaced in states that had never before existed in their imposed forms. The discovery and exploitation of vast oil reserves further transformed the Middle East into the beating heart of global energy, making it both immensely wealthy and perpetually vulnerable to external interference. The Arab-Israeli conflict, beginning with the founding of Israel in 1948, introduced a new era of war, displacement, and contested identities that reverberates to this day, turning the Holy Land into a battleground of both faith and geopolitics. The Cold War drew the region further into global struggles, with the United States and the Soviet Union vying for influence through alliances, arms, and proxy wars, while within the region waves of pan-Arabism, Islamism, and revolutionary movements rose and fell. Coups, monarchies, republics, and dictatorships each left their mark, often trading one form of control for another. In recent decades, the Middle East has been shaken by wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and beyond, the Arab Spring uprisings that challenged authoritarian regimes, and the ongoing struggle between tradition and modernization, between local identities and global pressures. To this day, the region remains both ancient and modern, fractured yet deeply interconnected, holding within its deserts, mountains, and cities the memories of empires long gone and the weight of decisions made in our time. The story of the Middle East is not one of simple decline or inevitable chaos, but of constant transformation, where resilience and conflict, faith and power, collapse and rebirth cycle endlessly. And as we step back from this vast sweep of history, stretching from the first farmers of Mesopotamia to the contested politics of the modern world, one question continues to linger like a shadow across the centuries. Is the Middle East destined to remain the eternal crossroads of struggle and ambition, or could it one day transform its legacy of conflict into a future of unity and peace?